disruption. The plans were disrupted. They intended to go to the DDA plan, the disperse, disarm and arrest plan. I think about 20 minutes later, the idea was they were going to put the barrier up. They expected the strikers to stay on the Kopi side of the barrier, on what amounts to a plain, really. I think slightly to the west of the Kopi. Thereafter, they were going to give Khalid was going to give warnings, 2 warnings translated into vernacular languages, as to what was going to happen, and then they were going to proceed with the DDA plan, and they didn't expect. Some would say they should have expected, but they didn't expect that what would happen would happen. In fact, would happen. What happened would happen, and they dealt with the situation as it happened. So that was something that wasn't part of the plan, but it wasn't part of the plan of what would happen, and they didn't deal with the contingency of what would happen if it did. That may be a ground of criticism in itself. But once it happened, it was really, I would have thought, for Carlos, if he'd known about it, he says he didn't know, or the JOC, the people of the JOC, once they knew about it, or I think Mr. De Rover takes a similar view, they should then have stopped the operation and proceeded more cautiously and differently. That, of course, raises factual questions that you don't have to get involved in. We unfortunately do, as to when the JOC first heard about it and first realized it. But it's not fair to say, I would suggest, that it was a planning problem, except perhaps the failure to foresee that that might well happen. It was a dynamic situation. The plan had been disrupted. The further question that then arises is whether what happened at scene 2 involved an endeavour to implement the plan. Some witnesses have said, General Mpembe, I remember in particular, said the plan was back on track by the time they got to scene 2. And what then was supposed to happen was the implementation of the DDA plan. So then the planning would be relevant at that point. But I'm not sure with respect, it's fair to say that it was simply the planning that was defective. But how do you respond to that criticism?
Chair, that's very helpful. I think my reference was to the plan. I wasn't suggesting that in terms of planning. I don't think. Whilst I did send my evidence yesterday, it could have been anticipated, and in fact, I think the evidence is that it was to some extent anticipated that if the POP came under attack and did, as the plan suggested, retreat to the Nyalas or whatever, then the fact that the TRT line would step in, it could have been anticipated. In fact, I think it was anticipated that people therefore could be engaged with the R5 rifles. Okay. So, do I think that in his planning that Lieutenant Colonel Scott addressed his mind to the fact that at scene 1 you end up with 17 people dead, and then he was suggesting that they would move on with the dispersal? Categorically not. I don't for one second suggest that he ever addressed his mind to that. So the point is, what I was referring to is that the plan effectively had, I suppose at that point, a number of stages to roll out the wire, as you described, Chair, to give the warning, and then to move forward. So when the wire gets rolled out, certain events then happen. We have scene 1, and then we sort of have the continuation of the plan. Scott didn't anticipate scene 1, I've said, but as you work through the choreography of this, then you have the sort of the second part of the plan, the disperse, disarm. Okay. So my criticism, therefore, in relation to the issues of command and control, I suppose, are threefold. Firstly, as you say, that Officer Callitz, who is the operational commander on the ground, I would have thought should have taken the decision to stop it if he knew. And again, as you say, there are issues of fact, which is for yourselves to resolve, not myself. If he didn't know, how could he stop it? Beyond that, then there are issues in relation to command and control with what happens next in relation to Mr. Callitz on the basis of the way the units were coordinated, and I think they weren't. And I think he gives oral evidence to the fact that, you know, at that part of the plan it became uncoordinated, I think is the word that he used. The second point then, and again you've referred to this, Chair, is the role of the jock, in so much as my understanding of the role of the jock is that they're supposed to be overseeing this plan, and that they should have, had they have known. And again, I think that there are issues in relation to facts in question as to whether or not and how much they knew. But to me, their purpose is that they should have been stopping that plan, taking a grip and saying things are going badly wrong here, if they knew. And the third point is...
Keep your third point for a moment. I did say yesterday I didn't want photographs taken. Would you listen to me, please? I didn't want photographs taken while the evidence was being led. The noise of the camera is distracting, upsets one's concentration. I did say that yesterday. It wasn't an instruction only intended to apply yesterday. It applies until further notice. And I'd expect it to be complied with. There's a gentleman sitting in the corner with the camera who's obeying it, which I appreciate, but it applies to everybody. So please bear that in mind. Otherwise, I'll have to ask the camera people concerned to leave the chamber. I don't want to do that either. Sorry, you were coming to your third point, Mr. White.
And the third point, therefore, then, in relation to command and control, is the fact that General Mapimbi is the overall commander who's in the helicopter. And I've said from the first engaging with this process, I don't in any way dispute the decision for General Mapimbi to go in the helicopter to effectively get a bird's eye view in his role as overall commander. Therefore, he can see more adequately what's happening. But again, he is the overall commander. Things are going badly wrong. Again, a question of fact as to what he knew or what he didn't know. But one of the points that I was concerned about is General Mapimbi in his evidence when he said that in his role of overall commander, he couldn't really do anything unless he was responding to a question from either the JOC or the operational commander. You know, if he was aware of this thing going substantially wrong, in any set of circumstances, I can't find an instruction in the policy framework which say, as overall commander, he couldn't step in at any time, because I think by definition he's the overall commander. If the facts were to show that he was aware, particularly of something as significant as what happened at Scene 1 happening, if, I stress, then, you know, all the more in relation to that statement, I just find it absolutely unacceptable.
Mr. White, returning you to the events at Scene 2, and perhaps the easiest way to do this would be to go in your final statement to page 116. There you, and in the pages that follow, you set out 6 of your key criticisms relating to Scene 2. Chair, we don't need to recite what those are, but Mr. White, if there was any elaboration you wanted to make about those criticisms in relation to Scene 2.
I think, Chair, in relation to the issues I've already highlighted, I think it's specifically with regards to what's referred to as Scene 2 and approaching Copy 3. And you know, the evidence seems to be that as police officers approach Copy 3, they come under fire from people within the copy. That's certainly, there's evidence that that's what they perceived. So my fundamental question is, why continue on into Copy 3 on the basis that if there is a threat to your life to do that? The plan is about disperse, disarm and arrest. I wondered just simply why police officers would be exposed to the danger of confronting live firearms, especially when the way the resources are configured at one stage, the copy is surrounded. So therefore, why send police officers forward into a situation where they're facing live fire, as opposed to, particularly if you have the copy surrounded, well then, if people are leaving, they can be stopped, challenged, searched, and there are police officers who give evidence, I think within the TRT line, that happens out to the west. But basically, to pause, to reflect, to have police officers in hard cover, as I would suggest, and then to see whether or not we can negotiate sort of further in relation to the arrest of the people who are on the copy. And I think Lieutenant Colonel Scott in his oral evidence sort of agreed with that proposition on the basis that, again, I just question the decision that if firearms are being used against police officers, why are we directing them into a position where there's a threat to their lives, and then therefore placing them in a position where they have to make this individual judgment as to whether or not they use firearms. I can't understand the rationale behind that decision.
Point that you don't deal with in the passage to which Ms. LaRue has directed our attention in your report, the subject to some evidence before us. And that was the apparent failure, I think admitted failure, by Brigadier College to give a warning. If the plan was back on track, they were once again busy with the DDA plan. They were busy effectively with implementing, complying with the provisions of Section 9 of the Regulation of Gatherings Act. And what is normally required there is a warning. In fact, they'd intended to give warnings. If Scene 1 hadn't happened, about 20 minutes later, they would have given warnings and proceeded with the DDA plan. It was only if the POP people found they couldn't perform their functions under the DDA plan that the TRT people were supposed to take over. So anyway, that's another matter. When they got to Scene 2, according to some of the witnesses, the plan was back on track. I know others don't agree with that, but some of them do. But in any event, there was prima facie an obligation for them to give a warning to those on the Kupi, so what was going to happen. And they didn't do that. And Brigadier Carlitz was criticised by a number of counsel, particularly Mr. Bezos in his cross-examination. You don't deal with that at all. I don't know whether you have any comments on it.
Chair, I think the reason that I didn't deal with it is because it wasn't that I didn't deal with it. I didn't choose to comment, simply because I'm very aware of what the plan was, the rollout of the wire, then a warning, then a period of about 20 minutes to let people leave, and then to move forward to disperse, disarm, and arrest. Because of the unforeseen circumstances that I alluded to in my previous answer, at Scene 1, I appreciate that Officer Callitz says he didn't know what happened at Scene 1, and again, question of fact. But given that after Scene 1, clearly there is a degree of chaos in that, with the gunfire that obviously lots of people heard, I think the crowd is scattering. People are sort of already moving, if you like, and then Officer Callitz basically forms up, starts to move forward with the forces that he was supposed to take, albeit the TRT are not there, and I know there's evidence that he asks where they are. But I think that, for me, I was sort of trying to engage with the circumstances now as they've rolled out. The original plan was to give a warning. I understand, the statutory and legal framework is about giving a warning, but I was sort of engaging with this in terms of a dynamic situation. People are scattering, I'm sure, when 328 rounds are fired, plus other rounds have been fired potentially at the police, and so there's a lot of gunfire. That's got to create a huge amount of noise. I'm sure lots of people, including probably police officers, are frightened and confused, and therefore my understanding of the situation is people are scattering all over the place. To some extent, therefore, people are already on the move, and to be fair, I therefore then didn't criticise this issue of not giving a warning at that stage, because to some extent I sort of thought, well, maybe we've already moved past that, and that's why I didn't particularly make that point.
Mr. White, staying with the role and responsibilities of Brigadier Carlitz on the day, and could I ask you to comment on the evidence, assume that the evidence shows that the various units that surround Copy 3 are unaware of the presence of other units, and Brigadier Carlitz is unaware that there's this encirclement now. Do you have any comment on what Brigadier Carlitz's roles and responsibilities in that situation would have been?
As the operational commander, as the senior officer on the ground, I think it's absolutely a requirement that Officer Callitz understands who is at that scene, and I think it's incumbent upon him to make sure that he knows all of the resources and that are there, that are present, and what they're doing. Having said that, there is also a responsibility. I know that there's evidence that some units moved to Scene 2 of their own volition. The fact that Brigadier Callitz is the overall commander, and therefore, the operational commander, so he's the commander on the ground. the fact that he is that and therefore has overall responsibility doesn't negate their responsibilities, for telling him. I mean, in some respects, he can't be held accountable for the actions of people when he doesn't know. But still, my criticism, I think, in relation to Officer Callitz is that, given the very serious set of circumstances that we're dealing with, that it is a requirement for him to be in a position where he does know what resources that he has available to him.
How can that work? He's on the west side, as far as I remember, of the Kopi. General Naidu, who's supposed to be at Forward Holding Area 1, has come up there, actually on his way to Scene 1, but he allows himself to be diverted, but we won't go into that for a moment. And he then approaches from the east side, where he meets up with the NIU people who've come from the northeast. It's not suggested that Brigadier Callitz could have seen them. It's not suggested there's anything, as I understand it, on the radio that he would have alerted him to their presence. Wasn't he entitled to assume that they're doing what they have been told to do, that the NIU people are at, it was Forward Holding Area 2, in that area. Naidu is at Forward Holding Area 1. That, in other words, they're at their appointed stations. They haven't come to the area where they are, where they're going to take part in the action at Kopi 3. What could he have done? I mean, how can you criticize him for not knowing they were there? The truth is, they should have reported their position to the jock, and the jock should have told him, by the way, you don't know this, but you should know that some of your people are not where they were supposed to be. They're on the other side of the Kopi, and you must bear that in mind in the orders you issue. Wouldn't that be fair?
Chair, if I could just assist Mr. White, because I see him going through the file. In Mr. White's supplementary statement, commencing at page 17, 2.5.7 is where he deals with Brigadier Callitz. This particular point is 2.5.11d, which is page 20, because I see Mr. White is flipping through his file. That reference may assist.
Apologies, Chair. Again, if I could ask Ms. LaRue, because I was slightly distracted in looking at this, could you please repeat again just what you said?
The reference is that in your supplementary statement, commencing at page 17, is where you deal with Brigadier Callitz. 2.5.11d, which is on page 20, is the specific point the Chair is referencing.
Yes, Chair, and I'm grateful to Ms. LaRue. I was actually just the reason I was distracted, I was starting to read 2.5.11 and looking for the particular point. So, as she says, specifically in relation to D, irrespective of the purpose of the reorganisation line in the plan, Brigadier Callitz can also be criticised for his failure to remain in contact with those units that were intended to be part of the follow-up to the dispersal action, particularly the TRT and the NIU. Whilst it might be understandable that Brigadier Callitz did not actively contact Captain Kidd's TRT unit at Forward Holding Area 2, given that that unit was supposed to be stationary in front of the informal settlement, and did not actively contact the K9 unit, which was not supposed to take part in the final dispersal at all, I would have expected that the operational commander to remain in contact with the TRT and the NIU units that were supposed to follow up the POP members as part of the plan. Accordingly, Brigadier Callitz must be held responsible, at least in part, for his lack of awareness that the NIU had arrived at Copy 3.
Mr. White, with regard to your saying that certain of the units went to the Kopi on their own, it was part of the original plan that some of the units were tasked with sweeping Copies 2 and 3 following upon the dispersal. And that's perhaps in the execution of that some of the units that were so tasked did that.
Well, I think in particular my comment was in relation to the TRT under the command of Captain Kidd. And his instructions basically were around the protection of the informal settlement. And Captain Kidd then, if my memory serves me correct, in oral evidence talks about hearing the gunfire and whatever over the radio and responding of his own volition. And so the criticism there would be not of Officer Callitz, who would not have anticipated that that would be happening at all, but of Officer Kidd. And I can fully understand, as a professional police officer, he hears this gunfire, he feels that he needs to respond to that. His task is to protect the informal settlement. That's not under threat, so he then goes to assist, and I would applaud and congratulate him for doing that. I think it's a very professional attitude to take. The criticism is he didn't tell anyone else, and therefore we're back to this issue. My key criticisms are in relation to things like intelligence, briefing, planning, and command and control. So the fact that Captain Kidd then takes his unit to do something which is out of sync with the plan and therefore can't be anticipated by other people, there is a requirement on him to make sure that certainly Officer Callitz, the jock, and other units are aware of the activity then he is going to take.
Mr. White, if we can then round out your command and control points, because we've covered a lot of them already. In your supplementary statement, page 16, paragraph 2.5.6, you deal with this question of command and control from the jock. If you could summarize that criticism and your conclusions for the Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Again, I think it's best if I just simply read this. In relation to the jock, it now seems clear that members of the jock were aware that the operation had gone badly wrong by the time that Brigadier Pretorius sent her text to IPID at 16:03. Any lingering doubts as to the seriousness of this situation could have been resolved by the time that Brigadier Pretorius had spoken to Captain Loest by telephone at 16:06. I cannot understand why in those circumstances members of the jock did not do more to contact the operational commander or the overall commander, or to act themselves to slow down or halt the operation and to regroup. Although Brigadier Pretorius gives evidence of attempting to contact Brigadier Callitz and Major General Naidu by telephone, no one else in the jock has given any evidence of making any attempt to make contact with the operational or overall commanders in light of the information they were receiving, or indeed anyone else.
Mr. White, if we then move on to the one explanation that the SABC have provided for what went wrong at Marikana with respect to radio communications. In your final statement, page 106, section 7.4, you deal with the issues around radio equipment. And of course, separately we have your criticisms about the use of call signs and the like on the radio, but focusing on the actual radio capacity of the SABC on the day, could you set out your key criticisms and comments?
Chair, just briefly, I think that in operations, large complex operations, it is not unusual for it to have problems with the radios, particularly around volume of traffic. And therefore, because it's not unusual, it's predictable, and I think in terms of planning, that sort of issue should have been discussed and consideration being given to having perhaps a separate command channel. I understand from, I think, TTT4, which are the minutes of one of the jock meetings, it specifically states that the radio department, for want of a better term, within SABC had highlighted the fact that there's a backup radio channel, I think it was channel 38 or something. So, given that large operations involving a number of units quite often result in radio traffic chaos, a bit like the traffic chaos perhaps on the way here this morning. Therefore, problems with radios are not something which I think would ordinarily come as a surprise. And again, as part of the planning, that should have been worked through. And then, as Mrs. LaRue then says, also beyond that, in terms of the use of the radio, the confusion in relation to instructions that were being given with a lack of call signs. And I've listened to some of the audio of the radio and read some of the transcripts, and I mean, it is very confusing with regards to the directions that are being given.
About that, can I just raise a point not directly relevant, but it's at the moment, but that is it the practice in Ireland, Northern Ireland, to keep a recording of all the radio traffic? One of the problems we have here is that apparently wasn't done, or it said it wasn't done. I assume, for the purpose of the question, that that's correct. We haven't got a complete recording of all the radio traffic. There are gaps. And quite important things happened, or should have happened, during the gaps. Our task would be made much easier if there was a complete recording. Do you do that in Northern Ireland? Or?
Simple answer is yes, Chair.
Mr. White, one final question on radios. If you were the overall commander or the operational commander of an operation in which 34 people were killed, and the reason you didn't know that that had taken place until a fairly lengthy period of time after it had happened, and you were told that the reason you didn't know is because there were radio problems, what would your response be?
I mean, Chair, I'll be outraged. When I used to get angry with people in work, you know, we have an expression in Ireland we call about fit to kill dead things. You know, it's basically an expression to show, you know, how frustrated and how angry you are. But it's almost beyond comprehension for me that an event of this nature, if I was the senior officer on the ground, and not even around the end of the operation when 34 people have died, but the fact that 17 people have died or potentially are dying, many more are injured in the middle of an operation, and as I, as the senior officer on the ground, don't become aware of that, not made aware of it, and again, question of fact, you know, but assuming the facts that I'm not made aware of that until, you know, a considerable period of time later, as opposed to even expressing a sort of a frustration around that, it's expressing a disbelief around that. I simply cannot comprehend a set of circumstances where that would be the case, that information of such magnitude is not brought to my attention somehow.
And picking up on the somehow, Mr. White, assume that there were radio problems. How would you expect to have come to know that the operation had resulted in 17 people being fatally wounded and others injured, alternatively later on 34?
Well, Chair, this comes back to the point that I made earlier on in relation to principally the jock. You know, what did they do, first of all, to stop or slow the operation, calm it down? What did they do? I've talked about evidence that Brigadier Pretorius has given around trying to phone Officer Callitz, and I appreciate that the phone didn't pick up because I'm sure he's busy. Similarly with Officer Naidu. But what else was done? Who else was phoned that? Given the magnitude of the situation, can we phone someone else who is close to Callitz? Can we phone someone who's not that close to Callitz but has access to a vehicle who can go and tell Callitz? There must be ways. And again, I suppose it's not for me to say exactly how. I'm asking the question. Well, what did you do? It's got to be a situation whereby, given the events that are unfolding, I would just simply say, well, what did you do? I understand, say, Brigadier Pretorius' evidence around trying to make 2 phone calls. Is that sufficient? So I understand there's a senior officer who was at scene 1 because there's evidence of some of the police officers handing recovered firearms to him. I forget the rank, Mr. Meir or Mary. I think he's a senior POPs commander.
Colonel Mary.
Apologies, thank you, Chair. Colonel Mary, did anyone try and contact him, because he is obviously pretty stationary at scene 1? So I'm just simply saying that I'm absolutely surprised that every effort wasn't made in order to bring this information to the attention of Officer Callitz, and would sort of ask the question then, because I haven't seen it in written evidence, I haven't necessarily seen anything further in oral evidence. So am I missing something around actually what people in the jock did to bring this information to the attention of principally Officer Callitz?
You're no doubt familiar with Brigadier Collitz's evidence about when he was at the scene and him shouting out orders, the noise of finialas, and if someone was trying to contact him on the cell phone, he might not have heard it. Is that your experience on the field as well?
Of course. The way our radio communications work is that we actually have an earpiece connected to the radio. So to some degree it sort of disturbs your peripheral hearing, if you like, of other things. And many times I've been in a situation where I have an earpiece here with the radio going. I have my mobile phone perhaps shoved up the inside of my RAD helmet. So I'm trying to make a phone call or listen to some instructions that have been given by phone. I might miss something in this ear in the radio. Obviously, at that point, I certainly am not aware of what's going on in the background. Alternatively, I take the mobile phone out, I put it in my pocket. Do I hear it when it rings again? So, suffice and fair to say, individual bits of communication can be missed. Happens all the time. quite often, if I'm the senior officer on the ground, I will normally have someone on my shoulder, quite often two people. One, a tactical advisor, I explained their role yesterday. Two, effectively a logist, someone when he hears me making a direction on the radio, when he hears me saying something to the tactical advisor, when he hears me saying something to the unit commanders, he'll be writing that down. One of the other functions that he would have is basically to monitor the radio and tap me on the shoulder, sir, did you hear that communication from, to make sure that I'm informed. But, would it be reasonable to say that an officer in the position of Mr. Callitz wouldn't necessarily hear every piece of communication that's being relayed? Yes, I think that's entirely fair.
Mr. White, in your experience in an operational commander role, have you ever had someone... Mr. White, just following up on your answer, when you've been in an operational commander role, I understand you may have the two people on your shoulders, you described them. Have you ever had a third person come up to you to convey information to you because they couldn't get hold of you?
Yes, absolutely. Where for some reason, and maybe it's about background noise, numerous occasions someone will come forward from another point. I did some work with the Metropolitan Police, and they actually operate on a system of runners. One of the things that surprised me about the Metropolitan Police, who are an organisation I have respect for, is that you'll see them, perhaps if you view television footage, they all have these handheld radios. They're not connected to an earpiece, and the amount of communication they must miss, just with these as opposed to having to connect to an earpiece. But I actually did the Senior Public Order Commanders course with the Met in 2004, I think it was, and I was surprised they actually have a system of runners, as they call it, where there are a number of people allocated to the commander who will run and transmit messages to other people and bring...
Remember, the origin of the Metropolitan Police was the Bow Street Runners, so that goes back many centuries.
Indeed, Chair.
Can I just understand why, with a handheld radio, you would miss communication as opposed to having an earpiece?
Just simply because, well, if you think about this, imagine your mobile phone. And on an iPhone, Apple very kindly provides you with those nice wide earphones. So if you have a mobile phone and you have your earphones in, you pretty much hear the whole conversation. If you imagine having a mobile phone without the earpiece, and say, for example, it's on speaker, and you're holding it in your hand while you're making a telephone conversation to the chair, and at the same time, lots of things are going on, and other people are distracting your attention and talking to you. So it's not even that you're having a specific conversation with the chair. Actually, maybe the chair has phoned you to have a bit of a chat around how yesterday went, and you're thinking to yourself, I don't really need to hear this, but he's the chair, and obviously I'll be polite. Yes, Mr. Chair, every so often, because you're monitoring the conversation, but you're not specifically engaged with it because you actually need to have a conversation with other people. Will you absolutely hear every word the chair says? No, you won't. If, on the other hand, you had an earpiece in, it's much more likely that you're going to. So it's not to say that that they will definitely miss, but certainly the potential is that you're much more likely to miss communications. Just simply because, even again, a bit like your iPhone, the volume only goes up so much, and therefore, if there's sort of ambient background noise, does whatever is coming out of the radio actually reach your ear, or do some other noises sort of override that? Whereas if you have an earpiece in, then that at least you hear.
Mr. White, does that explanation of a handheld radio versus an earpiece excuse other officers from ensuring they communicate with a commander and ensure confirmation that their communications reached the overall commander or the operational commander?
No, categorically not. What I'm referring to here is that, in my experience, in these large public disorder situations where there's a lot of different things going on, it is predictable that there will be heavy traffic on the radio. It is predictable that people will have difficulties getting through on the radio. It is predictable that individual people will miss certain things. All of that is I think, as I've said. My criticisms are in relation to, Officer Callitz, at least of the resources that he knows should be with him as part of the plan, maintaining contact with them. My criticisms are in relation to the jock, the overall commander, making sure that, given that this situation is clearly unfolding in a way that wasn't intended to unfold, and they're hearing instructions from Officer Callett's being given over the radio, which actually clearly suggests that the operation is continuing to happen. Even if they're assuming, well, Officer Callett knows about what happened at scene 1, and he is making a judgment to say, well, we need to move on with the second part of the operation and move into copy 3. Surely someone else must be making the decision to say, hold on, we need to take a grip of this. We need to stop this now, and to override his instruction. Or alternatively, maybe they're saying, clearly Officer Callett doesn't know, therefore we need to get this information to him. And I'm making the point that the jock, I would wonder where the evidence is, particularly the jock or other senior people. They all have a responsibility in this. What did they do? To get that information to him, or alternatively, it's the jock. The clue's in the name. It's the Joint Operational Command. That they didn't of themselves do something to stop this, to slow it down, to pause, and to reconsider.
Mr. White, moving on then to my next topic, which is covered at page 122, section 8 of your final statement. Chair, this is where Mr. White sets out his conclusions relating to first aid attention for the wounded. Mr. White, if you could briefly summarize your concerns and criticisms with respect to first aid provision.
Chair, very briefly in this, if you're planning an operation which anticipates high levels of force, well, then you need to make provision. There's a requirement to make provision in relation to first aid. I understand that part of the plan, Lieutenant Colonel Scott did make provision for first aid responders. So that's one point. Was that sufficient? Again, it's a question for yourselves, perhaps. But then it sort of then goes beyond that. So we have scene 1, and some of the evidence that has been shown to me is that at scene 1, there are police officers who can be seen on videos who are engaging in conversation, whatever they're talking about, I don't know. But it's obvious. Sorry, apologies, Chair. Sorry, I was just letting you finish your conversation.
Mr. Dakota raised a point with me which we raise with you when you get there in your evidence.
Okay. So the brief point basically is that there is video evidence which shows police officers who are standing in close proximity to some of the people who are lying down at scene 1. Some of those people are clearly at that stage not dead, but obviously injured. And I'm just asking the question as to why those officers are not giving first aid. I appreciate there's a first aid provision within the operation, and there may be good reasons, again, question of fact, as to why those first aiders are not actually treating these people. But they're not, is a fact. So my question is, well, why are police officers not even attempting to give any cursory first aid? It's a long, long time since I did first aid training. But one of the things I know about bleeding, and quite often gunshot wounds, obviously, is around direct pressure. So at the very least, why is some help not being given? Again, question of fact as to whether or not if earlier, even cursory first aid had been given, might some of the people who subsequently died actually survived? I don't know.
Mr. White, then finally, you're aware, of course, of the evidence of Mr. X, and of course it's not complete. You've interrupted him. But with respect to Mr. X's testimony, as we understand it, and of course this is something that you deal with in your response to the SABC in GW 10.
What page of GW 10?
In particular, it's paragraph 4, page 6. Mr. White, perhaps if you could summarize your response to the SABC here, and then I'll ask you some follow-up questions with respect to the Mr. X evidence.
Chair, on memory, I think I was asked to basically engage with two statements in relation to Mr. X. One, the first one, I think, is in relation to from February 13, and the second one from February 14. I think, in summary, in relation to all of that,
Mr. White, let me interrupt you, Chair. Just for the record, the SAP's interrogatory to Mr. White was they request Mr. White to express an opinion or advise his stated opinion, or to revise his stated opinion, were he to assume that the evidence of Mr. X is truthful. Sorry, Mr. White, I interrupted you.
Sorry, let me read that again because I interrupted you. There's a typing error which I'll correct when I read it. SAP's request Mr. White to express an opinion or to advise his stated opinion, were he to assume that the evidence of Mr. X, were he to assume the evidence of Mr. X to be truthful. And he's then, in his answer, this comes from the SAPS points of disagreement with the statement of Mr. White. And he then, in his reply, deals with the two statements effectively. There are a number of others, but for our purposes, there are two main statements of Mr. X. The one dated February 2013, he deals with in paragraph 4.2 and 4.3, I think, and 4.4. And then there's a subsequent statement a year later, February 2014, where a number of facts are stated or allegations are made which didn't appear in the earlier statement. And he then deals with them in 4.5 and 4.6, and then summarized in 4.7. That's correct. That's the position as far as the statement is concerned.
So, Mr. White, taking each in turn, if you assume that Mr. X's February 2013 statement is true, what response do you have?
Chair, as you rightly pointed out, my response is at 4.5 and 4.6 of my statement, which basically says that Mr. X's evidence in the February 13 statement is in many ways consistent with the intelligence that the police actually engage with, i.e. things that they knew that, amongst this larger crowd, there was a smaller group who, because of the events on the 13th, could provably be sort of recognised as potentially violent group. And then also the intelligence that they were operating on with regards to what was presented in the jock, that if police tried to remove weapons, then that would be resisted. So ultimately, I make the point that in relation to my key criticisms around issues that I covered yesterday on a number of occasions, intelligence, planning, briefing, command and control, accountability, I don't think it changes anything. The second statement of 2014, as you say, it basically adds additional facts in, which I think in summary basically represent a heightened level of threat from this group. And again, I respond to that, but perhaps in the interest of brevity, if I go directly to 4.7 of this particular statement, and I basically just say, accordingly, the contents of both Mr. X's statements, if true, do not change the opinions expressed in my final statement in any significant way. Although the February 2014 statement suggests that the threat from the Milton the threat from the Milton Group may have been even greater than believed by SAPS, this simply reinforces my view that substantially greater consideration should be given to alternatives, to a tactical option to disarm the strikers, and there should have been a substantially greater focus on intelligence gathering, planning, briefing, and communication.
Mr. White, in your supplementary statement, if we go to page 24...
Proposing to take the first break around about now. When you said finally a few minutes ago, I thought I'd wait, but it was finally...
it was the final topic, Chair. I have a few questions.
I'm not being critical. I understand how these things happen. But would it be convenient for you if we take the adjournment now? They give you a chance to go through your notes and proceed with due preparation and concentration to your final point. Would that be in order?
That's fine, Chair.
We'll take the short adjournment now, 15 minutes. Commission resumes. You're still under oath, Mr. White. Mr. Roux,
Thank you, Chair.
final canter. That word in this context, should I? Final lap.
Mr. White, just before the adjournment, we were dealing with the Mr. X case, if I can shorthand it like that. And you've dealt with it with respect to his two statements. I would just like to ask you the following, whether you accept the evidence that there is at least a group of the strikers who were gathered that underwent rituals that involved Muti.
Yes, Chair, I accept that.
And you accept that the group on the kopi in the hall had traditional weapons, and that there's conceivably a smaller, what's been referred to as the warrior group, that were also armed with traditional weapons.
Again, Chair, yes, I accept that.
And Mr. White, you accept that there may be evidence that there was the smaller militant group that were aggressive towards the police and made threats.
Again, Chair, yes, I confirm that.
Mr. White, if I could then ask you the final question of your evidence in chief. Page 127, paragraph 10.1.3 of your final statement. It's the last paragraph of your statement. Chair, I'm afraid I've done this wrong. There's a preceding point which I must go to first before I get there.
What's your final point? We're going to get your final point.
Indeed. Apologies, Chair. Mr. White, in your supplementary statement, apologies to you as well, in your supplementary statement, page 24, section 3.2, this is where you respond to the dispute between yourself and the SAPS with respect to, if I can call it, the nature of the threat or the nature of the response. Chair, perhaps it's easiest to read it into the record. The SAPS state broadly as follows. In broad terms, the SAPS accepts the general principles of public order policing referred to by Mr. White in his statements, but wish to test the relevance or practicability of the principles of the events as they occurred at Marikana. Further, there is a sharp dispute in the description in the nature of the threat, where Mr. White appears to move from a premise that the threat that the armed and militant group of 400 strikers presented a public order management problem, whereas SAPS contains that the threat the group presented with armaments and behavior well exceeded the boundaries of what a public order policing could manage. Mr. White, you then set out your response to that. Could you place that before the Commission, please?
Chair, I think that throughout all three of my statements, I've engaged with the fact and said frequently this is a difficult, complex, and most importantly, dangerous operation. I've acknowledged in, I think, all of my three statements the fact that there were a lot of heavily armed people with traditional weapons. I've made reference to the fact that I don't think there's any dispute that some of the threat that the police officers were facing in relation to particularly the events on the 16th included a firearms threat, and I think there's evidence, of course, to say that firearms were actually used against them. So at no point do I sort of try and deny the fact that this is a very, very difficult, complex, and, as I say, dangerous operation for the SAPS. And I think I've said a number of times in my statements, I've sort of sympathy in terms of, an organisation having to deal with this. However, and I think I alluded to this yesterday, these threats take place within the context of a large crowd. I don't know if the SAPS would suggest that everybody within that large crowd has a particularly violent intent in relation to the police. So this is a crowd management situation with additional complexities and additional sort of threats, if you like, added within that. And I think that, in summing up, I could go to 3.2.3 of my supplementary statement where I say, consequently, I do not consider that there's a sharp dispute between SAPS and me in relation to the nature of the threat faced. The sharp dispute is in relation to the response to that threat. Many of my criticisms are based on the fact that SAP's operational plan does not appear to have taken the potential threat properly into account. Notwithstanding the fact that the threat to the police was significant and specialist units were brought in to assist the POP members, I consider the situation at Marikana was a crowd management situation to be managed according to established crowd management principles. In the wide spectrum of public order events, the situation presenting itself at Marikana was extremely challenging, but that does not mean that the application of public order crowd management principles was no longer appropriate. My understanding is that Standing Order 262 continued to be applicable to the SABC operation at Marikana.
You have no doubt been appraised of the evidence as regards certain threats that were made to the police. One was the burning of the hippos, as they were called. Another was, we're going to die today, or words to that effect. You have been appraised of those threats?
Yes, I've seen the evidence of both Mr. Callitz and Mr. McIntosh that refer to those threats, I think, being made repeatedly. Yes.
So, Mr. White, then, finally, if I can direct you to page 127, the final page of your final statement, paragraph 10.1.3. And that essentially summarizes your attitude to the operation at Marikana. Perhaps we can just end by you reading that into the record.
Yes, Chair. 10.1.3, I say it is a matter for the Commission to judge the validity of the actions of the individual officers who used lethal force on the 16th of August 2012. However, even if there was conclusive evidence that every shot fired was justifiable, self or private defence, my opinion is that this operation represents a serious failure of public order policing. With better preparation, planning, leadership and execution, a situation in which more than 100 SABC police officers felt compelled to fire live ammunition is likely to have been avoided. The only one sort of amendment I might make to that, Chair, is basically when I say serious failure in public order policing, I think it's a serious failure in policing. Full stop.
Thank you, Chair. We have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Roux. Mr. Semenya, are you in a position to commence your cross-examination?
I am, Chair. Mr. White,
Before you start, would you like to do some housekeeping first, or do you want to do it as you go along? You've given us a file containing a number of statements, which you gave notice to those calling Mr. White, which he presumably had an opportunity to read. Do you want me to mark them as exhibits now, or how do you want to handle the matter?
Chair, can we do it on the beat as and when I...
If that's what you want to do, let's do it that way.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Mr. White.
Good morning.
Can I ask that we paint the context within which public order policing obtains? In democratic countries, it is a measure intended to give meaning to the right of assembly, am I right? And protest.
I think amongst other things, certainly public order policing also extends to things like football and wherever you have crowds, not just specifically related to protest.
Right, but because people have the right to assemble, the legal framework then assigns this type of responsibility to public order policing. Am I right?
I think that's correct, yes.
But one distinct thing about that right, it seems to me that it is a right which has its own internal constitutional limitations, i.e. you can do it peacefully, correct?
Of course.
And you also to do it without arms.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
Now, so that you then have a specialist unit in a democratic order that is responsible for crowd management operations. Am I right?
As I understand the position here in South Africa, yes, correct.
And I will try and go through some of these instruments with you just to have an appreciation of what it is that in some way balances all of these things out, if you follow my logic. Because the anticipation in the exercise of this right is that it is going to be largely, it's going to largely involve an exercise of a valid right. The constraints on the police to use force are therefore higher. Am I right?
Apologies, sir. I didn't quite follow.
Okay.
I think I might have missed a word. I didn't quite hear a word. Could you repeat, please?
Okay. In the expression of that constitutional right of assembly and protest, you then have, at least in this country, statutes that begin to flesh out how that right is to be exercised. And in our case, we have the regulation of the Gatherings Act. Correct?
Indeed.
And when you, at least when I read it closely, it seems to define for me even things of what the gatherings are contemplated in terms of that legislation. Have you paid that close attention? You will realize, if you do, that, for instance, it does not necessarily conceive gatherings of a nature that is about industrial dispute. I can take it to the definition of gatherings if you want me to. Should I?
I don't know that if that's necessary. If I could say for the record, Chair, I mean, I'm not in any way an expert or very overly familiar with the particular piece of legislation that you're referring to. I can say that having read the Standing Order 262, I understand, I think, the definition of both gatherings and demonstrations. But, I certainly stand to be corrected in relation to my understanding of that, but, perhaps I might need to be corrected at a later stage.
No, there is nothing very troubling about this. I'm merely saying that in a democratic order such as we have here, you'd expect to have a very complex set of legal rules and system regulating labor relations, for instance, where industrial disputes would be taken to, resolved, and addressed.
I'll be guided by you, but I'm sure that's the case.
Yes. Now, and on top of that, I can take it to Standing Order 262 if you like, but it also is really a standing order fleshing out what is in the statute, the regulation of the Gatherings Act, right? You can accept that.
Yes.
Now, even when we look at instruments which I think is the plinth on which your opinions are based, for instance, keeping the peace, the one distinct thing about those type of instruments is they make the fulcrum of public policing really policing by consent, as the document speaks, right?
I think that what it's talking about is that the ultimate objective of the police is to try and ensure that that situation maintains. We police communities and societies with their consent, and the whole purpose around a document like Keeping the Peace is to ensure that when we deal with complex and difficult situations, that actually we're very conscious of ensuring that we do so in a way that maintains that public consent.
So before Mr. Semenya continue, may I ask you this? Have you had an opportunity to study the Regulation of Gatherings Act?
No, Chair, I haven't, and I think that's why I made the comment earlier on in my evidence. I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a lawyer here in South Africa, so no, I haven't.
Now, I had just said central to maintenance of public order, there is a great dependence on the cooperation of the society where the public maintenance of public order must obtain. Am I right?
As I've said, I think that's the objective that the police should bear in mind when they're engaging with these difficult situations.
And if I understand those instruments, as I say, keeping the peace, public order management entails a confluence of cooperation by various stakeholders involved in any operation of this kind. Am I right?
Indeed, yes.
And it is central, if you are to produce outcomes that are desirable, that all the role players in a particular event cooperate with each other.
Well, I think if all of the role players in a particular event cooperate with each other, that's likely to contribute to the best possible outcome. Basically, what Keeping the Peace talks about is how you engage with stakeholders to try and encourage that situation to prevail. Of course, the reason that we have a document like Keeping the Peace is the fact that in difficult situations, not all of the actors, stakeholders, or participants do necessarily act in the way that we would want them to do. So therefore, you don't necessarily always get the absolute desired outcome that you're looking for.
No, I know I'll get there in a little while. But the proposition I'm putting to you, that you get the desirable outcome where there is every party comes to the party and do what they must do. That is the way that assures a successful outcome to a public order operation. Am I right?
Like I say, the hope would be, in fact, if every single stakeholder, every single participant or actor in any particular policing situation was operating in a way that was contributing to this desired outcome, then I don't think actually there would be a need for the police in the UK to have a doctrine such as Keeping the Peace, because ultimately, if everybody was playing the role to see if we can resolve disputes in a way that doesn't create any difficulties or problems, well then why would you need guidance to help you sort of achieve that? So, clearly this is what we would want, but we know the reality of life is it doesn't always work like that, so that's why there is a document such as Keeping the Peace which helps to sort of guide police commanders in preparing for these things.
Yes, Mr. White, the chair in the past would say to witnesses, don't try and answer a question you anticipate will follow. The proposition I'm putting with you is plainly correct, am I right? That everybody playing their part, the outcomes are almost always the happy one.
If everyone plays their part, then the outcomes are almost always a happy one. Yes. Apologies, Chair.
Thank you. Now, and also, conversely, when the wheels get off the wagon, you would want to see in what respect the one or other of the role players did not bring their weight to the wheel, correct?
I've no dispute with that.
Sorry?
I don't dispute that.
Right. And when I look at the regulation of the Gatherings Act, which the chair referred to, in fact, the whole structure is to obtain what is called a Section 4 meeting, where you know who is going to be in the march, what resources are necessary, what medical is necessary, who is going to do the marshalling, etc., etc. Am I right?
I've seen that.
He hasn't read the Act, he must just accept what you say. But of course, you'll also appreciate that Section 9 of the Act does deal with a situation where the police have to take action like disarming, dispersing, even arresting in certain circumstances, because there are dangers, threats to public peace. So the Act isn't entirely directed at specific, peaceful, ironic gatherings. But the witness doesn't know anything about that, so you can't ask him about it, except putting propositions to him.
Well, even if it is without reference to the Act, Mr. White, that is your understanding about how planning of public operations happen. You involve all the role players, you define their roles, and you draw an agreement, and you have a written plan. Am I right?
As far as possible, yes.
The trickier one obviously would relate to instances where they are spontaneous and therefore there are no plannings and therefore there may be unforeseen circumstances for which some measure of planning must happen, but we'll get to that later. Am I right?
Correct.
Now, you were aware that this commission was established to investigate a number of things. Am I right?
Indeed, Chair.
And the Marikana incident with which you are now familiar is intended to probe, or the Commission is intended to probe around that event the role played by the various stakeholders, if I were to call them that, correct?
Yes, I understand that to be the case.
Yeah. Just for completeness, even the other instrument relevant to public order policing that comes to mind would be the HMIC document, the rules of engagement.
I'm familiar with it, yes.
That too has as its at its center the emphasis on making sure that these operations have the confidence and the support of all the role players when they are staged. Public order
Again,
operations.
In its general intent, yeah, I think that's reasonably accurate, yeah.
That too transported into the APP as well.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, a proper investigation, I gather, of what would have happened in Marikana would entail probing, as I put the expression, where the wheels got off. You look at the role of the police, you look at the role of lawmen, you look at the role of the unions, etc. Am I right?
I think that would be fair and reasonable, yes.
Yes. And I was quite surprised that your brief seemed to be saying, just look at the conduct of the police. That was your brief, right?
That's absolutely correct.
And I want to suggest to you, Mr. White, that as an independent expert, commenting on a public order operation that went awry, you would have said to, as you call them, your legal team, but this will give a very skewed report, because I must be able to comment on the roles of others to see whether or not they did or did not have an impact in the resultant outcome. Fair to say?
I don't know if that's fair to say, in that I don't think my legal team at any stage tried to hide any evidence from me in terms of the role of others. I mean, I've been provided with transcripts of meetings between the police and lawmen, for example, and certainly I've been provided with a lot of evidence which shows, as Ms. LaRue was referring to in her sort of closing remarks there, about the sort of potential violent intent of at least some of the people within the group. But my experience, as I referred to yesterday, is on the basis of 30 years policing. My understanding was I was being asked to provide expert opinion in relation to, based on my experience, and therefore I don't think it was actually unusual that I was being asked to look at the role of the police in this, because that's what I know best. But I do think that that it's fair to say that there was no intent, no attempt by my legal team to try and shield from the fact that obviously there are other role players within this, and some of the things that they did or did not do. But my brief was to comment in relation to the role of the police, and I accepted that as a reasonable proposition.
No, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm merely saying that you hold expertise in relation to the role, for instance, of the community in public order operations, correct?
I have lengthy experience in dealing with these situations where engagement with the community is a requirement.
And you have expertise and understanding in relation to the role of the public in public order management operations. Am I right?
Yes, indeed.
So you could competently have given us your expert opinions about the appropriateness or otherwise of the conduct of the strikers in the Marikana tragedy. Am I right?
I'm not sure what you would have anticipated or wanted me to say. I mean, I've said throughout this, is there a real threat within this operation to the police? Frequently I've said that. So therefore, logically, that threat potentially comes from at least a section of the crowd, who therefore, I think logic would show, are clearly not going to be overly cooperative with the police. So I'm not sure ultimately what the point of the question is, and I'm not being
I'll repeat
obtuse.
it. I'll repeat it. You hold expertise in relation to public order management operations to give expert opinion in relation to the appropriateness or otherwise of the conduct of the strikers, for instance, in this case. Am I right?
Maybe that's a... Yeah. Okay, I'll say yes, and then let's see where it goes.
Thank you. And you also hold expertise, and you could have given us your expert opinion in relation to the appropriateness or otherwise of the conduct of lawmen in the resultant tragedy that resulted. Am I right? You hold that expertise.
Well, as I said yesterday, I have limited expertise in relation to dealing with industrial disputes. But if your point is about having experience with regards to dealing with different stakeholders aside
Correct.
from the community, then yes, I do. But again, I caveat my answer by saying I don't really understand the implication of the question. And again, I'm not trying to be awkward. But so I'll say yes, and then perhaps I can help you further at a later stage.
Yes. And so you could bring your critical scrutiny into looking as to whether, for instance, in this Marikana operation, whether the unions would have acted appropriately, or what could they have brought to bear in producing an outcome that is desirable. You have that type of expertise. I'm just exploring that your expertise is not limited to the conduct of the police.
Well, I'm more than happy to discuss my experience in relation to dealing with stakeholders involved in these types of situations beyond the police. Do I have any particular experience or expertise in relation to the conduct of unions? No, I don't. But again, in order to be helpful, for example, I explained yesterday that a lot of the difficulties that we have in Northern Ireland relate to the parading situation. So there are a number of actors there, like the parading institutions, the bands, residents' associations, the Parades Commission themselves, all actors, stakeholders who you can contribute to this, and have lots of experience in dealing with those.
You see, I'm trying to get us at a point where we don't leave this commission with a conclusion that the South African Police Service must be put at a level where a resolution of public disorder must accept on the one equation that people will come with spears, they will come with pangas, they will come with murderous intent, they will come and attack the police, and we must get our police at a level equivalent to contain that. That would be the wrong approach completely, Mr. White. Am I right?
I'm genuinely not following you. I understand, if I understand the question properly, what you're saying.
I can explain it.
Please do.
if we are to avoid another Marikana, we cannot leave this commission with a recommendation that says the police must be upped to the level where they always are to deal with people who are armed informations with murderous intent and an intent on killing the police. The message must come out of this commission that says, in a democratic order, you need to have the law-abiding tolerance so that the police can also discharge the maintenance of public order and peace. Isn't that where we should be going?
I don't think that's an unreasonable proposition, and I hope that's what comes out of the Marikana Commission.
And therefore, with the benefit of your expertise, it would have been possible to have you tell the Commission that the proper play by lawmen in this public disorder would have been A and B and C, so that its recommendations, lawmen as a stakeholder could see where it aired with the benefit of your expertise. Correct?
Well, I think that there may well be things that lawmen could have done differently. There may well have been things that the unions could have done differently. There may well have been things that the strikers themselves could have done differently, all of that. And as I say, I understand that that's what the Commission will address themselves to. However, my brief was to look at this from the point of view of the police. That's where I have expertise. And beyond that, if all of those people have contributed in a different way, then it still requires the police to have an operational approach to the situation. And that's what I commented on. If all of those actors had have acted differently, well then maybe the outcome would have been different. But I would still feel that my assistance to the Commission is best in relation to operational policing, because that's where my experience is. But going back to the earlier part of your question, when you were talking about the rights and responsibilities, I mean, one of the things that we talk about all the time around European Convention on Human Rights in my own country, and the fact that it's now primary legislation, is with rights come responsibilities. I do not for one second try and suggest that lawmen, the strikers themselves, etc., have responsibilities in relation to this. My brief was to engage with the police, the issues in relation to the police. If your question is that you feel that perhaps I should have pushed back on my legal team and said, no, I feel I should be contributing more and I should be giving expert opinion in relation to the rules of the others, then, to be honest with you, I think there's a point of disagreement with us from the point of view that I feel my expertise is in relation to operational policing that happens within that wider context. I'm sure other people are far more able than me to be able to talk about the intricacies of the activities of unions or the mine company or whatever.
No, I thought, Mr. White, we had agreed that your expertise is public order policing. And we have agreed that that field is a field which operates with multiple parties who sit together and who bring their weight to the equation. That we have gone past it now, I think, haven't we?
I absolutely agreed with that point. That's
correct. So you would be able to bring your informed experience and opinion and expertise in advising this commission what would have been an appropriate part to be played by this group, that group for a desirable outcome. That expertise you have. Am I right?
I'm not sure ultimately, therefore, what my conclusions would have been and how helpful they would be. If I was to say that I think lawmen should have perhaps at an earlier stage agreed to give the miners more money, then maybe all of these events could have been avoided. I think the unions should have been more conciliatory in relation to the amount of money they were asking for. I think the strikers shouldn't have been as violent. They should have. Would that have been of value to you, Chair?
I would suggest it would be a value to the Commission, Mr. White, because the finding of the commission would also be having the benefit of an expert opinion of the kind you hold. And I would have been able to argue on the basis of your expert opinion that I'm able to drive a submission of where a lawman could have gone right or wrong on the strength of an expert opinion of Mr. White with such wealth of experience. That's what I'm going.
Of course, the difficulty with that is one doesn't want him to express expert opinions on matters which he has no expertise. If you think of the Marikana situation as being like a sick patient who's got lung cancer, who's got a broken femur, and a few other diseases as well, maladies as well, you have a number of doctors come and give opinions on the patient, what can be done to heal the patient. The cardiologist, who also got heart trouble, the cardiologist talks about the heart, the oncologist talks about the cancer, orthopedic surgeon talks about the fractured femur. You don't expect the cardiologist then to say, well, by the way, while I'm here, I'll tell you what I think about the fractured femur, and I'll tell you what I think about the lung cancer. He is called as an expert to deal with one part of the problem, namely the police, their operations. He has expertise, of course, in something else, and that's dealing with disorderly people who cause public disorder and require policing operations. And by implication, he wasn't asked directly, but by implication, he's expressed criticisms of the strikers because he talked about the magnitude of the threat, he talked about the problem the police had. Clearly, if he'd been asked to elaborate on that, he presumably would talk things about the fact they shouldn't possess the weapons, they shouldn't go around murdering people, injuring people, or making threats. Those are his areas of expertise. Those are linked to the sort of cardiac problems the cardiologist would talk about. But frankly, if he comes along and tries to give evidence to us about how he thinks trade unions should behave, dealing with matters of industrial relations and so forth, or he tells us how he thinks employers should behave, how they shouldn't be obstinate and difficult and possibly cynical in the way they approach the matters, because these are all criticisms that we will hear in due course, I'm sure, then frankly, I would tell him, do you know anything about that? Have you got experience of that? We're not interested particularly in your views on that. So I'm not sure that the proposition you're putting to him is entirely accurate.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very grateful.
Chair, perhaps two things immediately. You would be aware, Chair, that one of the concerns my clients have is that we are 18 months into this commission hearing. 90% of what we do has been probing the police conduct, and where the terms of reference clearly point to a probing of a multiple areas that may have contributed to the result. On the time frame now given, the rest of the matters have to be done in a month.
Yes, so can I respond to that? You talk about the present time frame. As you know, an application has been made for an extension, and we will get the result of that, I believe, quite soon. And if the extension is granted, then of course we won't just have a month. But to deal with the point you made more fully.
And also...
Sorry, can I finish? I'll give you an opportunity. We started off with evidence which took much longer than we thought it would, but of the objective facts on the ground, what the people who went to the scene found and so forth. We then moved on to the evidence, I think it was, of AMCU. They led their evidence, and their conduct came under scrutiny, and Mr. Mutunja was extensively cross-examined, and other AMCU officials, I think. Then we had evidence from NUM. The NUM people gave evidence. They were extensively cross-examined, and from the president of NUM down to the shop stewards and people on the ground of Marikana, that evidence was also examined fully. Then we had people like Mr. Maguriwana and Mr. Pacha among the strikers. They gave evidence. They were cross-examined extensively. At that point, as far as I remember, you produced the statement of Mr. X, and Mr. Mpofu took the view that he would like to call evidence later to deal with what Mr. X was going to say. And he gave statements. We've got statements of 2 witnesses whom he proposes to call, as I understand, fairly soon after Mr. X's evidence. We then started on the police case. You led a number of witnesses. Some of them were extensively cross-examined. But a number of witnesses you led, and you obviously have to, because there are a lot of police actors involved in this. There were certain reasons which I don't have to go into as to why some of the cross-examination of some of the police people took far longer than we thought. Documents that had previously been asked for and were said to be non-existent finally appeared on Colonel Scott's computer, and that led to lengthy cross-examination. And other documents came forward as well. Certainly a lot of time has been spent on the police case for various reasons. But the point I'm making to you is that AMCU has been under the microscope, NUM has been under the microscope, a number of witnesses have come from the strikers' side. We're now busy with the police, we're near the end of the police evidence. This witness, of course, is being interposed for logistic reasons. We're then going to turn to Lonman. And I know the police take the view, and this has been stated in the opening statement, that Lonman behaved badly, that if Lonman had been cooperative and done things that they were urged to do by the police, then you will contend in due course, I take it, that what happened on the 16th of August wouldn't have happened, and you may well have submissions to make in regard to the 13th as well. But the point I'm making to you is I'm not sure that this witness can help us much in relation to the criticisms to be directed against Lonman. Those criticisms will not be ignored. They will be fully investigated. We've already had cross-examination of Mr. Da Costa on issues of that kind. So there's already some of that material is already before us. So I can understand the police saying the impression is created we are the sole people who are being criticised. And that's not fair, you would say. Now, of course, if that were correct, you would be entitled to say it's not fair. But certainly the other persons who are listed, or other parties listed in the terms of reference, whose behaviour has to be examined, some of it has been examined, some of it still will be examined. This witness, though, is, I would have thought, in the position of the cardiologist, and the metaphorical example I put to you, who can help us to deal with the cardiological problems. He can't help us with very much, anyway, in relation to the behaviour of the unions or the employer. As to say, by implication, and presumably if you ask him more about it, he will say more. He can criticise the behaviour of the strikers. He's already conceded that there was a very serious problem that the police had to deal with. I understand him to say he's got great sympathy for the police. The problem, of course, was armed strikers who were gathering in circumstances not covered by the entrenched right of gathering or assembly in the Constitution, who were in possession of weapons, who refused to hand them over, and some of whom appear to have used them to murder or injure people, or certainly threaten people at various times. That is very serious misbehaviour, which I take it he can elaborate on if you want him to. But I don't think the main thrust of what you said with respect is correct, and I thought it appropriate for me to say so.
Chair, as you would say, posterity one day will want to look at this transcript and see what it is that we did. And one of those things that posterity I would like to see is to read that as SABC, we took all the points we deem relevant in relation to the evidence of the witness. And I acknowledge the hypothetical example that Chair you're making. But this witness, that's where I started. I said you are an expert in a field where confluence of various players are intended to operate in a particular way to produce the desired outcome. Now, I think it's fair, Chair, with respect, that I should...
I'm not stopping you. I'm just saying to you, it's a matter of emphasis. You can obviously ask him about the employer. You can ask him about the trade unions. You can ask him about the strikers. I'm not stopping any of that cross-examination. But what I was resisting was the suggestion that he can testify with equal authority and expertise and experience in relation to the behavior of Lonman, which was to really come under the microscope to some extent. And the Lonman representatives here will, I'm sure, be pleased to hear that that scrutiny is going to continue when the Lonman witnesses come. You can't deal with him, with Lonman's behavior, with the same depth that you can deal with the evidence of his opinion evidence in relation to the police, and, as I've said, by implication, the strikers as well. And the same applies to the trade unions.
Mr. White, examining the evidence, you did realize very early, did you not, that the tragedy in Marikana had as its origin an industrial dispute?
Yes, indeed.
About which, as I will show you later, you say the employees were demanding significant increase in their salary.
If I've said that specifically, then I accept that. Yes.
And I was quite intrigued by the adjective you used, that it was significant. What informed that?
On reflection, I assume that it may well be as a result of what they were being paid and what the request was for the increase. And when you compare the two figures, that might seem to be a significant rise.
But I take it you did not know the numbers.
I think, could you point me to the particular part of my statement where I say that, and maybe I might try and help you?
Certainly. If you go to your provisional statement, WW2.
Yes.
And to go to page 14, you will find on that page paragraph 3.1.2 dealing with the events of Marikana and a summary. Are you there?
Yeah.
There it reads, on 9 and 10 August 2012, about 3,000 employees commenced the strike at Lonmin's Marikana mine in the northwest province of South Africa. They were demanding a significant increase in their salaries to 12,500 per month.
I see that. That's correct. Yeah.
Well, to that I had asked you, did you know what the numbers are? What were they earning? What were they not earning? And why 12,500 is a significant increase?
First of all, I wrote this statement a long time ago. I'm assuming that there was obviously information in front of me which said what they were earning and allowed me to sort of make the assessment that from whatever X was to 12,500. I'm foggy with regards to what it was. Perhaps you could help me with regards to what that figure was.
Let's move on a little, Mr. White. You're also aware, having read the evidence, that what the strikers really demanded on the copy was merely that the employer must come speak to them. Right?
I've seen a lot of evidence where strikers have made that request, I think actually often through the police.
And in your experience, a demand of that nature, if capable of resolving a a public disorder. It's one that attempts must be made at meeting it, no?
In my experience, if there's anything that can be done in order to try and avoid disorder, that's what you should do. And I note that Mr. De Rover, I think, says something very similar, where he talks about, I think your mouth is your best weapon. In other words, if we can talk these situations down, of course.
And you also saw the evidence, what I invite your comment on, of the police, even at the highest level, trying to persuade lawmen into talking to the strikers on the copy.
Sorry, Chairperson, the evidence is actually to the contrary. I mean, the evidence is that the police at the highest level, Lieutenant General Mbombo, were essentially telling lawmen to take a hard line against the strikers.
Mr. Chatterton, there was also evidence, I think, from General Mpembe.
The highest level is Lieutenant General Mbombo.
No, the highest level is actually General Fiega, the National Commissioner Fiega. But let's take the highest level out of it in this case, say at a high level.
The highest level that engaged with lawmen was Lieutenant General Mbombo on record.
That's correct. But let's just limit it to a high level. At a high level, the evidence is General Mpembe did ask the police, ask lawmen to deal with the strikers, and lawmen took up an attitude. They had a 2-year contract, and it wasn't a 2-year wage agreement. It wasn't necessary for them to engage, and there were various other reasons they gave. So there is substance in the point being put by. It isn't quite at the highest level. I understand the point you're making based on the transcript of the discussion between General Mbombo and Mr. Mokoena, which presumably will be dealt with later when Mr. Mokoena comes to give evidence. But subject to the deletion of the word highest, I allow Mr. Sabina to ask his question.
Mr. Chair,
Actually,
even that superlative degree is, in my judgment, correct. The National Commissioner came the Monday and even asked, who are these faceless people? Let's try and examine these things. But an objection of what degree of seniority?
I've disallowed the objection. I said you can carry on.
But it goes further because when the negotiations were taking place and the request was made of the negotiators, that message for the employer to come to the scene to talk to them was passed back through to lawmen. That is the evidence.
When Lieutenant Colonel McIntosh was being cross-examined by Mr. Mpofu, it was made clear he was operating in two capacities. One capacity as a policeman trying to get people to lay down their arms, dealing with the public order aspects of the matter, and the other as a kind of an intermediary or messenger, taking messages from the strikers to the employers and from the employers to the strikers. So the point you make is correct. So I allowed you to proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Given your expertise, you would have found the conduct of the police to have been appropriate in those circumstances, Mr. White, am I right?
Just to clarify, were the police pass on messages from the strikers to the management or to the hierarchy of the unions that they wanted to negotiate?
Well, let's start at this level of encouraging dialogue around to the impasse.
Yes, I'm entirely supportive of the police encouraging dialogue, yes.
And you have seen, looking at the evidence, the extent and at which that effort was done by the police in trying to dissolve the dispute. That would find to be appropriate behavior, wouldn't you not?
I agree, and I endorse the comments of the Commissioner when she talked about Mr. McIntosh in particular doing this, yes, and I think I've potentially commented on that.
One could go a bit further, couldn't one? One could say that this is a matter that obviously will be dealt with more fully when witnesses come back from London. But the view, I think, has been expressed. I'm interested to get your views on it. Not quite in the terms that I'm going to put it to you, but the view's been expressed that really the police were given a rather poor hand to play, if you use a card-playing analogy, try to get the strikers to leave the copy, lay down their arms and so forth, because of the attitude adopted by the employer, that the police were doing their best to solve the problem by negotiation. But it will be said, and has already been said, that the attitude adopted by the Lonman was unhelpful and made the police task more difficult than it would otherwise have been. Are you in a position to comment on that?
I think that the opening sort of questions that I referred or answered were around if every single actor lived up to what we would see as their responsibilities, would that ultimately lead to the best possible outcome? And I said yes. If Lonman's had been much more compliant, perhaps it would have led to a different outcome. Mr. Semenya asked about do I have experience in this type of thing, about dealing with the different stakeholders. I gave a lot of evidence yesterday in relation to my experience. I just briefly reflect back in things like parades disputes. You have a number of actors there, and it is incredibly frustrating around the intransigence of some of those groups in relation to their firmly held views as to what should happen. And I'm thinking, if only they would give this little bit of ground, and they would give this little bit of ground, it would make the situation a lot easier. But they don't. I can have a view on them, I can be sort of critical and whatever, but the bottom line is, whatever the position is, I then have to deal with that. And I can go home at night and be really, really frustrated, and I can have a particular view on particular stakeholders, but it doesn't actually change the fact that here is this really difficult position as the police commander I need to deal with. I wish it was different, but it's not. So how do I deal with it?
Well, you see, we're going to be ultimately asking the Commission to tell the rest of South Africa and the rest of the world that it is inappropriate to come with murderous intent and attacking the police in any democratic order. So, but I want to rest all of those opinions on at the back of your expertise, Mr. White. You see where I'm going?
Yeah, I would just simply respond in saying I absolutely agree with exactly what you've said. I hope you do tell the world and the rest of South Africa that it is absolutely wrong to come to an event like this with murderous intent, and the fact that, amongst all of the deaths, 2 police officers were killed in this is something I'm extremely cognizant of.
And to expect the police in this country to raise their level of skill in using rubber bullets to contain this type of violence, that would be a wrong direction for this Commission to send us a message. Am I right?
I think that the key criticisms that I've made in relation to the police, as you say, my criticisms are only aimed at the police because of my brief, are hopefully intended to be helpful to the Commission in relation to, I think, if these things had been done better, then potentially, even with all of the difficult circumstances in place, then potentially, maybe the tragic outcome may not have happened. It may still have happened, we just simply don't know. But I do look at the events across those number of days, observe the evidence, raise my concerns and criticisms on the basis of my experience, and I hope that's helpful to you, Chair, and to the rest of the Commission in deciding how you might want to make recommendations going forward that perhaps a situation of similar type might be avoided in the future. I don't know that my criticisms are suggesting that in any way that the police always need to be, and I don't know if this is the insinuation in the question, and if it's not, I apologise, but I don't know if you're suggesting that my recommendations or my criticisms will ultimately lead to the South African police being armed at the teeth to be able to always deal with a very violent group of spears, and I don't know, and I apologise if I've misconstrued.
Shall it be a convenient stage for the tea?
If it's convenient for you, it's convenient for the rest of us to take the tea, Joe.
It is.
We'll adjourn for 15 minutes. Commission resumes. Mr. White, you're still under oath. Mr. Semenya.
Thank you, Chair.
Before you start, Mr. Semenya, can I just ask Mr. White, have you been furnished, Mr. White, with the statements from the other parties, Lonmin, Nome, AMCU, injured and arrested, to...
Certainly, Commissioner, I've seen a number of statements from parties other than the police. Have I seen every single statement? I'm not sure. I've certainly seen statements from parties other than the police. I'm pretty sure Lonman's, I would even just look at my legal team just around helping with my memory, but certainly categorically I've seen statements other than from the police, yes.
And have you had an opportunity to be appraised of their evidence as well, as it appears on the transcripts?
Yes, I mean, and I've seen things like transcripts of meetings between, for example, the Lonman's management and the police, and have read those, yes.
And their evidence in court, and so far as they've testified?
No, I haven't been directed towards the oral evidence of those.
Thank you, Mr.
White. What you've seen, I get the impression, I want to know whether my impression is correct, that there was a difficulty in regard to your getting transcripts of the evidence of witnesses who testified in Afrikaans. And we've been trying to get, there was talk of translations being prepared. I don't know what's happened. I don't need those, so I haven't seen them, but I don't know how far they've gone with that. But there was at one stage, certainly, I was told, a problem in relation to showing people like you transcripts of evidence of people who testified in Afrikaans. Is that still the case? Or?
I would be confident, Chair, that I think that certainly any evidence that my legal team felt, and obviously I'll be very open. Clearly, I to some degree was obviously in their hands. I'm confident that they have tried to show me, evidence basically of this entire picture. I haven't seen any oral transcripts in relation to people. I'm pretty confident, other than the police, haven't engaged with that. If it's helpful, of course, I haven't been engaged in this process constantly. I was engaged initially when I received evidence from the SABC hard drive, and that's largely from there that I prepared my provisional statement. Then there was perhaps a bit of a hiatus, and then around the completion of my final statement, which obviously was a fairly lengthy process, given that it was almost 130 pages, and I engaged with further evidence, Lieutenant Colonel Scott's hard drive, etc., and also some of the oral evidence that was the Commission has heard. Another hiatus, and then it literally was probably around 3 weeks ago. I then received a further brief from the South African Human Rights Commission around, here's the new evidence, and as I've said openly in my supplementary statement, neither I or the South African Human Rights Commission will be trying to say to the Commission that this is now the entirety of all of the evidence that your good selves have heard since my final statement in October 2013, because I just think that would be impossible. I mean, in my own office at home, we started to print out the key transcripts from the National Commissioner, General Lubombo, General Mapembe. I think General Mapembe's oral evidence ran to something like 4 Lever Arch files. I mean, it's literally a couple of thousand pages or something. I have done my best to try and engage with as much of that as I possibly can, but I would be lying to you if I said that absolutely can have engaged with every single page.
And Chair, if I could just clarify, with respect to evidence that wasn't given in English, the Brigadier Carlett's English translations of the transcripts are available on the Commission's website, and those are what Mr. White has been provided with. Other witnesses, if it hadn't been translated, we would try to do as best a translation as we could, or sort of summarize and translate into English, and provide those to Mr. White with non-English witnesses.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Semenya?
Thank you, Chair. At the back of your expertise, I take it the Commission can say at the end of the day that to avoid another Marikana, a party similarly situated like Lonmin is better to be more facilitated facilitative and not obdurate if that position would avoid a tragedy. Correct?
Again, I think that's the ideal that we would all want to work to, as I said in the previous answer. And in addition to that, perhaps if I could refer to 2.3 of my supplementary statement, when I ultimately say, this is in relation to questions that have been asked of me that I think have been referred to earlier on. Any criticisms that I may direct towards the police in regards to their actions at Marikana is in no way intended to absolve any other party of their responsibility or obligations under the law or civic duty.
Yeah, it is more a quest on my part to see how, with the expertise you have, a party similarly placed like London should, in other circumstances, behave to avoid these outcomes. So that's what I'm trying to go with you.
Well, again, hopefully, to be clear, my experience of these types of situations is that if everyone is prepared to enter into the spirit of compromise, it is much more likely to lead to an outcome which lessens the likelihood of the police having to use any type of force at all. Because you raised this in the context of my experience just before we broke for the short moment, I had been making the point that in my experience, unfortunately, a lot of actors don't necessarily play the part that we would want them to. It would be great if in my country there was a commission which would in somehow be able to enforce those other actors and stakeholders to live up to what I consider to be their civic duty and responsibilities. But I don't know that they're in a position to do that.
But a ringing message must always come, even from a commission such as this, that it is important that we all operate within the parameters of permissible behavior, if we are police, if we are employers, if we are strikers, etc. And that's why this conversation I'm having with you. It's important that the ringing message must come out. No?
Well, I don't disagree with you. I think that, given the context in which you place that, of course, you would want all stakeholders to live up to what are considered to be their responsibilities. Of course you would.
And even in relation to the unions, I don't know if you're familiar with the evidence that this complaint of the RDOs is one that is as old as 2009, complaining about the same thing until it manifested in the manner it did in 2012. On the basis of your expertise, would you say that there could have been something done differently by the unions?
Chair, referring to the interjection that you made earlier on, I'm not familiar with all that the unions have done in this ongoing dispute, certainly not stretching back to 2009. I would say, for the record, again, as a professional police officer who's lots of experience in dealing with these particular types of situations, perhaps if everyone comes to them in a spirit of compromise and prepared to negotiate, well then ultimately we can avoid the police ever having to use any force at all, a lot less higher levels of force. But I don't genuinely understand what the relevance is of the question in relation to, could the unions have done more? I haven't engaged specifically with that, but if Mr. Semenya says that he thinks that perhaps they could have, then I'm not going to disagree with that, but I don't really think that's an area within my expertise. I think I've been very clear in relation to how I think there's a responsibility in all people. Even if you take it right back to, there should be a responsibility in all citizens to act properly and within the law. But you know what? Sometimes people break the speed limit. Sometimes people steal things out of shops. Sometimes people assault each other in the street. If they didn't do any of those things, would that likely to be a better outcome in relation to policing? Of course it would. But unfortunately, life's not like that. But just to come back to your particular question, I don't know the intricacies of this particular dispute and what the unions did or didn't do. So I don't really feel that I can comment much more on that.
No, Mr. White, you see, the public order policing is a slightly different proposition, is it not? there you are dealing even with the fact that the use of force, if it should be there at all, at its very highest is a rubber bullet, or what you call the attenuated energy projectile in the UK. That's the level, that is the highest level of containing public disorder. Am I right?
On occasions, the threat level, certainly in Northern Ireland, extends beyond that, as I give a lot of evidence yesterday. So therefore, sometimes actually the threat level is such that the tactical tactics employed by the police actually go beyond AEPs to sometimes live rounds.
Well, that's in exceptional circumstances. The rule really is non-lethal force must be used to contain public disorder. Isn't that right?
Yeah, as far as possible, that's correct.
And it is principally because, unlike in robberies and other violent criminal behavior, there is no such constraint on the response appropriate by police in those circumstances. Is there?
As in to say that when you're dealing with a robbery...
As in saying a police have a duty in thwarting a robbery to use less than lethal weapons. There's nothing like that.
Robberies and robberies, I think you mean serious robberies like cash heists and that sort of situation, don't you? You don't mean just an ordinary robbery. You mean very serious robberies where firearms are used and that kind of thing.
The general concept that we adhere to in the UK in relation to policing around the use of force is about minimum use of force in any circumstances.
No.
When police officers deploy to any situation, so let's take it a non-public order situation, a robbery, as you say. If police officers are attending a robbery with firearms, or they're maybe even attending a robbery if somebody's carried out with baseball bats and threatening people with weapons like that are not firearms, then the police approach to dealing with that will be, again, to use the minimum level of force. We don't routinely carry AEPs in all police vehicles. Even the public order police don't carry routinely AEPs. That tactical option is reserved for when planning an operation, in the way I explained yesterday, when the silver commander is required to give consideration to how he or she is going to plan this out, they might think, based on the threat and risk assessment, that they require AEPs. That's part of the tactical plan which the Assistant Chief Constable, the gold commander, has to approve. Specifically on AEPs, there are various levels of authority. The authority to issue AEPs is at the level of Assistant Chief Constable. If you can convince him or her that there's sufficient threat, they will give you authority to issue it out of a station armoury to be carried in a vehicle. And in our context, we actually then lock them in a lockbox in the vehicle. As the situation develops, and we see how this plan is unfolding, if the threat level is such that these things might need to be used, then the silver commander makes a judgment as to whether or not he or she gives authority to deploy, take them out of the vehicle and make them ready. And then there's a further level of authority, which is authority to use, again by the silver commander. After that, it becomes the individual choice of the police officer based on the circumstances, now that he has authority to use, whether or not he's going to fire, given the circumstances he sees in front of him. Now, that's in a public order situation. As I say, the tactical support groups who deal with public order don't just deal with that. The majority of their time is spent engaged in searching and other types of activities. So they don't routinely carry them. It may be that because of an increased threat situation, that they may get authority to carry them over a period of 2 weeks when the Assistant Chief Constable has been convinced that there is a need for them to have immediate access. So he gives the authority to deploy in a particular geographic area over a defined period of time. So park that. In relation to the types of officers that we would send to more serious day-by-day incidents, robberies, as I was asked for in the question, we would likely to be sending our armed response vehicles to those. The armed response vehicles are officers specially trained, I explained this yesterday, who have lots of tactical options ranging from the traditional police truncheon and handcuffs, individual CS spray, they can spray on someone's face. They, not generally used, but those officers would be armed with taser. They would also be armed with AEPs. They would carry AEPs all the time. And they're also armed, as their name suggests, with lethal rounds. When they go to engage, for example, a robbery, then they have to make the assessment as to what they think that they need to do. And again, this will be guided by a level of authority, because this is a firearms incident and there will be some senior officer who's been engaged, if there's time, to basically guide in relation to what types of tactical options are appropriate. So therefore, AEP may well be used in that type of a situation, which is categorically and definitely not public order. But it's being used because it's far more preferable in those circumstances to see if you can engage this threat and to neutralize whatever the threat is by using a single AEP round as opposed to using a live round.
No, I accept that lawfully, police of whatever rank and level, even civilians for that matter, are only justified to use force proportionate to the threat. That's not my inquiry with you. But I'm saying in police training there are various levels of training. And at one end of it is training that is intended to adequately contain violent, serious robberies, as the chair is describing, for which POP members are not necessarily so trained. Is that a fair statement to make?
Would we send POP members, as you talk about, to an armed robbery? If it was absolutely necessary because there was no one else to send, well, of course we're going to. But as a choice of first preference, no, we would send the armed response units, and I explained their function.
And by converse of logic, if it's a public order thing, you don't send the armed response team either. You send an appropriate level of force to contain it as best as they're trained.
That's correct, and I've covered this in my final statement. I'm not sure which particular paragraph, but where I talk about if in a public order situation the level of threat is such that it's requiring also a firearms response, then we would deploy the armed response officers into that situation. I explained in my statement how that would be done, and I also then alluded to the fact that even at the higher levels, again, our most specially trained people in relation to firearms would be the SSU, the Special Support Unit, which I'm assuming is perhaps a bit of a read across to the STF, as has been described here. And part of the reason, Chair, that I say that potentially a read across is that when I saw Lieutenant Colonel Scott talk about snipers, if we were deploying snipers, it would be the SSU, the Special Support Unit, it would be doing that. And because he said it was the STF, I'm assuming there's perhaps a read across there. I might be wrong in that.
Can we deal with an appreciation of the nature of threat Marikana was emanating from the strikers? I invite us, Chair, to exhibit quadruple 8, which is the...
A8. 4 8. Quadruple A8.
No, man. Quadruple?
A8. It's a quadruple 8.
Quadruple A8, which is the supplementary statement. Of Mr. X.
This is not his supplementary statement.
No, it's not a supplementary
This
statement.
is the statement that he made, which is in one of the case dockets.
Correct, Chair. I just want us to deal with various paragraphs from there and solicit your reaction, Mr. White. If we start with paragraph 4, says on Thursday, 2012-08, I think the screen has a different one. It must be quadruple A8.
According to the heading on the screen, we are being shown Exhibit quadruple A8, which is from docket CAS 205. Take it as 205/8/2012.
A82.
Quadruple A2. I think that's what you're looking for.
The list in your bundle of documents to which the witness has referred of item 8 contains a number of statements, 9 of them in fact.
So it's the second one in that list.
And the last one listed is quadruple A8, which is the one. Now we've got quadruple A1.2. That's the typed version of one of the statements he made.
It is the right one.
It's right.
That is, according to my notes, that quadruple A1.2 is the typed version of the statement he made on the 7th of February 2013. What we've dealt with so far has been, I mean, the commissioners and the witness, were the two main statements which Mr. X made. The first one being the 7th of February 2013, which was discussed by the witness in his supplementary statement. And then there was the second statement made in February this year. But what we've now got on the screen is the typed version of the first main statement, as it were, the one February 2013, 7th of February. We've got on the screen now paragraph 4 of that statement. Is that the paragraph which you wish to refer the witness?
I'm indebted to you, Chair. For the record, it is at quadruple A 8.2. 1.2. Then, Mr. White, it reads, on Thursday, the 2012, 0809, when the strike started, it was agreed that all of the RDOs must not report for work and that we must meet again at 8 o'clock a.m. on Friday, 2012, 0810, at Wonderkop Stadium. On Friday, 2012, 0810, at about 0800 a.m., we met again at Wonderkop outside the gate of the stadium. There were a lot of people, about 5,000 to 8,000 people, and we're now joined by people of other sections or departments, but all mine workers. There were 5 of us who were nominated to represent us when talking to the employer about our demands. If I stop there, I'm going to be seeking to convey to you that you see a certain level of organization in what ultimately proves to be the warrior group, the militant group, or the armed group, or the tight group. Are you with me?
Yeah, I'm happy to accept that clearly this is an ongoing process. As you say, people meet and leaders are identified and nominated. I don't know that there's evidence in that particular paragraph that directly links them to the warrior group as you describe at this stage, but you know, the fact that people have come together, many people, and have nominated 5 members to represent when talking to the employer, suggests that, does that suggest a degree of organisation? Yes, it does.
No, I'm just alerting you where I'm going. I'm just trying to take the excerpts of the statement, and ultimately I'll say that it shows a particular level of organization. I'm just trying to have you walk with me.
Sorry, my apology. I think you criticized me earlier on for trying to guess ahead. I thought that you'd asked me a specific question, and I was responding to that, so I apologize.
That's perfectly okay. And if you go to 6, you will see then he discusses the Saturday. And says, on Saturday, 2012-08-11 at about 0800, we met again at Van der Kolk Stadium. We're still many. We agreed to go to NUM offices, to close NUM offices. We went to NUM offices singing slogans, songs. We passed the first gate to the hostel, passed the bus stop, past the taxi rank, and near the toilets of NUM, we were stopped by mine security. And the security started firing upwards with rubber bullets, and we started running away to different directions until we all met at the Mountain Kopi near Nkaning Informal Settlement. And there they were addressed by various individuals who told us that we will not meet at the stadium again. It's the mine property. We will hold our meetings at the mountain henceforth. You've noted that, haven't you?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Paragraph 7 then says, mentions some names there and says, they were further addressed us that we must unite, and seeing that the security are shooting at us, we are not going to get our demands. They told us that we must organize a Nyanga to protect us from being shot and make us strong. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
If I may just interrupt myself, you're not familiar with things like the use of muti, are you?
Before engaging with this process, I'd never even heard the word. I'm slightly more familiar with it now because of the evidence, obviously, that I've read.
And you don't know what influence, if any, it has on people who apply it?
I don't know. I can only form a judgment based on the information that I've read.
And at the level of fact about which you base your opinions, you would accept that the evidence is that they thought this motive would render them invincible.
I accept that there are a lot of circumstances I come across where people believe things and I can't understand why they would believe them, but I wouldn't question that their strength of belief in them, and I don't think that in engaging with this evidence it's either my place to question the level of belief in it, and I don't think in forming my judgments that I have questioned that belief. In fact, I think I've tried to enter into the process on the basis of, if that's what people believed, well then look at the evidence with regards to how these circumstances unfolded, accepting that is the position.
And neither are you exposed to many incidents of public disorder in this country where mutis are alleged to have been used and where no such allegation exists in relation to those containment of public disorder situations. Am I right?
The only incidents of public disorder that I've engaged with in terms of this process, as I think I was clear about yesterday, is the circumstances relating to the 9th to the 16th of August.
And whilst we're still there, I mean, as an expert, you'd agree with me, won't you, that police operations rely in building their doctrine on past experiences that build up. Am I right?
Of course, I think experience is always going to inform, an ongoing process. Yes.
And in their debriefings and informing their operations, they would learn from previous lessons of successes and correction of previous lessons of failures. That's how a police organization works.
I think that's how any professional learning organisation should work, yes, I agree with you.
Including the police.
Absolutely, including the police.
Yes. And you do accept that South Africa experiences a high degree, a huge number of public disorders in a particular year, at least in our recent past. You are familiar with that history, with that fact, not history.
I have certainly been given some information which suggests that there are a large number of public order, public disorder type situations. I wouldn't be qualified to say whether it's huge or not, and I say that genuinely because you've challenged me earlier on around my use of the word significance, so I don't think I'm qualified to say that, so I won't.
High is a better word to use, you say?
There do seem to be a lot of incidents, absolutely, yes.
On which the police have built a particular reliance given the success rates that they have achieved over the years.
Again, I'm very conscious that Mr. De Rover comments on this in his statements. I'm genuinely not in a position to judge from the point of view that I've engaged with the evidence in relation to the 9th to the 16th of August. I don't know the circumstances in relation to any of the other incidents, so I can't draw conclusions as to whether or not they were dealt with very well. At this moment in time, I'm more than happy to accept your suggestion of the evidence of Mr. De Rover that perhaps they have, but I genuinely cannot comment on that, and I think I've actually commented to that effect in relation to some of the questions I've already answered to the SABC legal team.
Well, where I'm going with this is that where you talk about police planning, you must be placing some measure of value in what the past experience in relation to an event is for the purposes of that planning about which you express opinions.
Sorry, maybe your question slightly deviated from what I thought you were asking me. I thought that you were asking me that the sort of position that police operational planning should adhere to lessons learned from previous experiences, and if that is the question that you asked me, then yes.
Of course. Now, whereas the evidence stands that given the history and successes of previous operations, the police have never, ever confronted a situation where an unfurling of a barbed wire would trigger an attack on the police. If you accept that as a premise, you cannot falter their planning on the basis that that should have been foreseeable. Am I right?
Firstly, to be absolutely crystal clear, if you accept as a premise that in the history of public order policing for the South Africa Police, that the rolling out of barbed wire has not resulted in people charging towards that wire, then I think it would be fair to say then there would be absolutely no expectation that in the events of the 16th that would happen. However, I would say to you, in order to engage with that premise, are you saying to me that that is the case, that in every situation in relation to public order policing in South Africa, that in the rolling out of the wire, it has never ever happened?
I don't know whether you asked me a question.
So I did share. I've said, Mr. Siminyana said to me, if I accept the premise that this has never happened before when wires rolled out, that people charge forward, would it be fair to base expectations that when the wire was rolled out on this occasion, that people wouldn't charge forward? And I said, based on that premise very clearly, yes, I think that would be a reasonable expectation, of course. But I then said to him, engaging with that premise, is he then able to say to me that actually that is the case, that in the history of public order policing in South Africa, in relation to the high number of incidents, I think as he described it, that when wire has been rolled out, that there has never ever been a case that people have charged before the wire? And I think that's a fair question to ask back.
That
is, it's not normally the function of witnesses to ask questions of those who are cross-examining them, and it's not a good precedent to establish. He's put the premise to you. He's got an answer. If he wants your answer to have value, he may have to lead the evidence to support the premise. But with respect, it's not for you to ask him questions.
But Chairperson, we do with respect have a practice in this commission that a practice that we were trying to enforce only the other day, that where a proposition is put, if it's not contained in the evidence in the transcript, a statement to that effect has to be given. And if it is contained in the evidence in the transcript, a reference must be given.
Yes, but that's a different situation. There where evidence is put, then one expects, and we've said it must be a statement setting out the evidence, unless the proposition put involves a conclusion from circumstantial evidence. The circumstances are already before us. But here, a proposition was put. He was asked to accept whether its correctness is an assumption. He did. So I'm saying if the assumption isn't established to be correct, then the answer he's obtained won't have any value. I don't think we need to take it any further than that.
Chair, while we're dealing with potential objections to this premise, in Mr. White's supplementary statement, page 10, little 2, at the top of the page, there's a reference to the transcript. It's day 137, page 14579, where the evidence of Lieutenant Colonel Scott is recorded that he anticipated the risk that upon the commencement of dispersion action, the strikers would move towards the police and attack. So I just want the record to be clear that we're asking Mr. White to assume it was not anticipated, where we have evidence from Lieutenant Colonel Scott that it was.
Chair.
What page is that again?
Page 10 of Mr. White's supplementary
Paragraph?
statement.
Paragraph?
It's the paragraph at the top of the page, little Roman 2. This is recapping.
Yes,
and then there's a transcript reference, footnote 36.
Yes, I understand. But what he was talking about was the commencement of a dispersion action. And what we are dealing with now is something which I think precedes the commencement of the dispersion action, namely the putting up of the protective barrier. There was, of course, the suggestion in one of the plans that it wouldn't be a good idea to have the wire trailers there on the Wednesday, because that might provoke the strikers. But I think that the proposition put by Mr. Semenya is an accurate one, and not contradicted by the passage on page 10 of the supplementary statement to which you refer. So I think Mr. Semenya can continue.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just saying from experience, when one critiques a police operation, it is a critique that is often not done with the benefit of hindsight. Am I right?
Well, I think all critiques are ultimately done with the benefit of hindsight. That's a bit one. I would hope that I've tried to engage with this process and trying to understand in offering up some concerns and criticisms. I've tried to engage with the evidence and try to understand what the circumstances that the police officers were engaging with at the time, and base my judgment on the decisions that they were making at the time with the benefit of the information that they had, as opposed to having the luxury, I would say, of the 2020 hindsight aspect. So, yeah.
That's what I'm going. Typically known as the reasonable officer test. You measure their conduct based on information that was available to them at the time they acted in the matter under scrutiny.
And that would only be fair to him. Anything else would be unfair.
Would it be convenient to take the lunch adjournment now, Chair?
Yes, Mr. Semenya. We try to be back at 1:45.